purpose of this is to reflect on my work, showcase my accomplishments, and inspire other developers. I'm Paul Avalone, and I make games. The very first video game I ever worked on professionally was Facebook's Horizon Worlds, later rebranded as Meta's Horizon Worlds. Forward XP was contracted to make content for the World Hop minigames, where 2 to 4 players would compete in 3 random games selected from a pool of minigames. Here's some insight into my work on them. When deciding on what game you're going to make, you need to ask yourself 3 questions. 1. Who is your target audience? 2. What are the game requirements? 3. What are your resources? First-time VR user to experienced VR veteran. That's a wide range, so it needs to be simple to learn and play, while equally fun for a wide range of skill levels. What are the game requirements? Playable by 2 to 4 players, 1 to 5 minutes long, competitive with scores and a winner, can be played standing or sitting, a fun experience that's unique to VR. What are your resources? Limited memory. There was a cap in the amount of objects that we could have in the world. So imagine you're going to build something and have a limited supply of lumber. Limited models. We couldn't import outside models and were restricted to using basic shapes to construct them. Also, no transparency scale, so objects could either be visible or invisible. So imagine you can't sculpt one block of wood into a unique form, but can only cut it into basic shapes and piece them together. You can't make this, but you can make this. Limited programming language. The code was written in a beta drag-and-drop visual scripting language similar to Scratch. Its intent was to be simple so regular people playing Horizon could make user-generated content without being overwhelmed, but it also meant it limited what we could do. The language was being created at the same time that we were using it as well. Imagine having the knowledge and skills of how to use a bunch of tools, but only having access to a workbench that is missing half of them. Which is kind of like using a hammer on a screw instead of a screwdriver. You can do it to get the job done, but it's wrong and inefficient. Lastly, everything had to be built in VR. So imagine doing all of that with a bucket on your head. I'm going to focus on just 2 of the 4 games that we released. I actually worked on 10 other prototypes that were all shelved at different stages of completion. We were never going to release 15 plus games. It was all part of the development process of rapid prototyping, something I got very good at while working on the project. Rapid prototyping is the process of making and testing out basic features of an idea as quickly as possible to see if something's worth pursuing. If it's worth expanding upon, that's great. And if it's not, then you didn't sink enough time into it for it to feel like a waste. And you learned something. Brush Rush. Sometimes a shelved prototype is eventually brought back. Brush Rush is the very first game I prototyped in Horizon, which I originally called Painter. I initially conceived it as a game sort of like Splatoon, where the players would go around an art exhibit that was all white and shoot paintballs that would turn the walls and the sculptures to their color. When time ran out, the person with the most of their color would win. It was shelved because it was decided the games needed to be playable standing still, so running around the museum was out. Later, after working on other prototypes, I came back and looked at it from a new perspective. Inspired by the minigame Stamp Out from Mario Party 4, I changed the game from a 3D landscape to a 2D landscape. I made an 8x8 grid of white squares that the player would shoot at. Filling the square would get you some points, but getting the full row or column would clear them out and give you more points. To make it more dynamic, we had it so a completed row or column in one color would leave behind some temporary black squares that couldn't be painted. We also added 2 features to make the players engage with each other more and be more competitive. One was a power-up that players would rush to shoot first that sped up the fire rate of their gun for a short period of time. The second was the border around the grid that would change color to whoever was in first. This would encourage the other players to target the winning player to stop them from completing a line. In addition to making the game more dynamic, both of these added a slingshot element that is important to party games, as it allows for exciting upsets, close calls, and the feeling that anyone can have a comeback and win. We also experimented with a more cooperative version where you as a team would toggle through colors on the gun and work together to copy a displayed pixel art painting. When it was completed, the next painting was a larger grid with more colors. It was too easy for someone to grief and ruin the game, so we tried a different version, giving everyone their own separate grid, where they would race to finish first. But now the players were too isolated from each other, so we scrapped that version as well. Robo Arms. Iteration is an important part of the game development process. The best example of that in this project was Robo Arms, which I originally called Robo Arms. Iteration is important, but sometimes you nail the name on the first try. Initially inspired by Real Steel, Aliens, and WALL-E, I prototyped 2 cubes that when you grabbed would control 2 giant mech arms that would mimic your movement. The original intent of the game was that you were in a junkyard crushing cars with your mech arms, then stacking the junk cubes as high as possible. It was really difficult to stack the cubes without them falling over. So I changed it so you would pick up and dump the cubes in a hole for points. The junk cars turned into alien spaceships that you would smack out of the sky. Grabbing was super floaty, so I themed it as tractor beams. I also changed it so that the ships would drop bombs that you needed to absorb before they exploded. Grabbing bombs was replaced with a more fun use of the triggers. Now, in addition to swinging your arms to hit the ships, the robot arms now had piston fists that would shoot out to punch farther ships. At one point, the ships shot lasers, but it was just adding visual noise, so we scrapped that. Eventually, we rethemed the enemies from alien ships to steampunk blimps. That's a lot of iteration, but if you look at the initial prototype compared to the finished game, the core mechanic remains the same throughout. Smacking things with giant robot arms that mimic your movement. After the gameplay loop was solidified, next came even more iteration and polish. Developing the enemies. The ships originally were very Space Invaders-like. A large cluster of them slowly circling downwards and respawning back at the top. To make them more interesting, I took inspiration from Galaga, a game that itself is an innovation of Space Invaders. Starting from paper sketches and later programming in the game, I designed a fleet of different movement patterns, formations, speeds, sizes, health, and hit points. Like most prototypes, they started out as just different colored boxes that were eventually replaced by the artists on the team. I worked closely with the artists to give them looks that were distinct from each other and matched their function. Similar to Brush Rush, we wanted more interaction between the players, so we made the scoreboard update to display the current rankings. We also added an additional enemy type we called the Hot Potato. It was a stun bomb that the players passed around. When its timer ran out, it would temporarily disable the player it landed on. It diversified the enemy waves, added tension, and additional player competitiveness by letting the player decide who to hit it towards. Developing the arms. I did several things to make the arms as satisfying as possible to use in VR. The arms move slower than your movement to give them a hefty feeling of weight. Powering on and off lights and sound effects to convey to the player that they had control in an exciting way. Controller haptics on piston punches and enemy collisions with well-timed clanking and steam sound effects. The forearms and biceps of the arms have gaps to reduce the obscuring of the other players and enemies on the field. Developing the instructions. Instructions are commonly overlooked by players. Most players hate reading, so the more you can convey with pictures and as little text as possible is best. For Robo Arms' instruction diagram, I made it so the basics of the entire game is completely understandable by looking at just 3 pictures. Malware Mayhem and Ocean Cleanup went through similar development processes of rapid prototyping and iteration. By the end of the project, all 4 games fulfilled all of the game requirements. You might have noticed as I was breaking down the process of making these games, I swapped between saying I and we a lot. All of these games were done by the collective effort of multiple people. The games are only as good as they are because we work so closely together. We bounced ideas off each other, play tested together, and gave feedback all the time. We would get frustrated at times by the technical limitations. A phrase that we would repeatedly say to each other was, "You're expecting too much." It was our way of saying, the thing you're trying to do isn't possible. And that's okay. But what would be possible? All tech has limits, no matter how advanced. Overcoming the unconventional tool restrictions required a ton of creative thinking for design, programming, and art. Being able to discover workarounds or clever alternative solutions was immensely helped by working in tandem and sharing tips and tricks we learned. At the end of the day, thousands of people played and enjoyed our games. And that's pretty neat.